Okay, in this video, we're going to look at the nullification crisis that happens during Andrew Jackson's term as president. And one of the things you have to understand about the nullification crisis is that it's a theory that some people, even still today, will bring up, but it has to do with the idea of, can a state declare a federal law unconstitutional? And this goes back to kind of a separate idea. It's not in the Constitution that it could do that, but it's this idea that the Constitution was ratified by the states and therefore was essentially a compact or an agreement by the states. And so therefore it leaves it up to each individual state to see, is the federal government living up to their agreement by only making laws and doing things that the delegated powers of the Constitution say they have. And so if a state that determines that the federal government has overreached and is not following the Constitution, then it would be their right, based on this idea, the theory that the Constitution was a compact or an agreement between the states. It's their right to decide they're not following the Constitution, and so therefore we don't have to follow it. This theory has been rejected by federal courts, which makes sense. I mean, it's federal courts. It makes sense that they would reject it. But they say the Constitution is not a compact of the states, but of the people. If you think of the preamble of the Constitution, we the people of the United States. And so that theory today has been mostly done away with, the idea that states can nullify laws. But way back in 1830s, it was very much a problem and really a new issue or a newer issue for this still young nation to deal with. And so it focuses on the Tariff of 1832. And the Tariff of 1832 replaced the Tariff of 1828, which you'll remember from the last video. John Quincy Adams has that passed, and it passes that in 1828 right before he leaves office. And a lot of people expect Andrew Jackson to change it right away, and he doesn't. He leaves the tariff in place. Andrew Jackson believes in growing manufacturing, believes in helping our young manufacturing to grow, and a protective tariff is not necessarily such a bad thing. He may have agreed that the tariff of 1828 was a little bit too high, but so that's why 4 years later he is willing to lower it with the tariff of 1832. But it's many states, it's not low enough, as a matter of fact, but especially South Carolina. The tariff of 1832 lowers the 1828 one, but not enough. And so they're very upset. And one of the people that kind of leads the charge against this law is John C. Calhoun, who just happens to be Andrew Jackson's vice president. Well, this leads to a split, and John C. Calhoun ends up resigning. Now, there's other personal issues between them as well that led to the resignation, but John C. Calhoun resigns as vice president. When Jackson runs for his second term, Martin Van Buren will replace him as his will replace John C. Calhoun as Andrew Jackson's vice president. So John C. Calhoun leads the charge in South Carolina and really writes a lot of the theory. He's the leading proponent of this nullification theory. And they basically declare the new tariff of 1832 illegal, say it's unconstitutional, and the basic idea is that it's hurting one part of the country and helping another part, and that's not constitutional. They don't have the right to do that, is the basic idea here. Jackson is furious with South Carolina and John C. Calhoun about this whole prospect, and John C. Calhoun is a strong proponent of nullification. He says that the states do have the right to cancel federal law they consider unconstitutional based on this kind of political theory that I talked about, the compact theory, that the Constitution is a compact between the states. And he's a strong supporter of states' rights in general at this point, and also of slavery. So this nullification issue is going to come up later with slavery. And so this theory is going to play out not just on tariffs and declaring tariffs unconstitutional, but also in other laws that could the federal government could pass. And so slave states are going to use the theory of states' rights and this idea that states can nullify a law when slavery becomes a bigger and bigger issue as well. So this is kind of a foreshadowing of future conflict over the issue of slavery. Daniel Webster is another leader at this time. And the thing about Andrew Jackson, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, they're all in many ways strong supporters of a growing America. And we talked about the American system. So while John C. Calhoun doesn't support these really high tariffs, he did support lower tariffs and does support growing manufacturing. And they all saw how the War of 1812 really hurt the United States. And so they wanted the manufacturing to grow. They wanted these other things to grow. But how it all worked out was not always, they didn't agree completely on how to work those things out. Daniel Webster agrees with Andrew Jackson that states don't have the right to nullify federal laws. He states the Constitution gives that Supreme Court the power, the Supreme Court that power to decide if laws are constitutional, not the states. And so Daniel Webster in this particular instance is going to be on the side of Andrew Jackson. And so we start to see some conflict between these three leaders that in many ways during the Monroe presidency were kind of agreeing. Now, the person we haven't brought up here is Henry Clay. Henry Clay was a supporter, obviously, of the American system, and Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay become enemies as well. And so what we've got is a growing problem. What are we going to do? Who can declare this? Who can decide? Is this some? Can the states declare this unconstitutional? Can they not? What's going to happen? What's going to happen when South Carolina refuses to collect the tariff? Because that's what it's going to come down to. South Carolina has declared the law unconstitutional, and they're going to stop collecting that tariff in South Carolina. Well, how's Andrew Jackson going to deal with it? Well, Jackson is actually willing to support a lower tariff. And so in the process, John Quincy Adams, his enemy, Andrew Jackson's enemy, is actually getting a lower tariff passed through Congress. But at the same time, he asks for a force bill, which would give him the power to use force to collect the tariff in South Carolina. So he could send troops into South Carolina to force them to collect the federal tariff. And so this is a big deal because all of a sudden now the American president is going to send American forces into a state and say, you use force necessary to enforce this law. And that's not the kind of thing that you really want to have to do. And fortunately, the lower tariff is passed, and South Carolina therefore repeals the Nullification Act because they're willing to pay this lower tariff. And so this crisis is averted, but it's going to continue to bubble up in the future, both around tariffs and the issue of slavery.